In recent years, technology has dramatically impacted the sport of bass fishing, with continual introductions of innovative product and a mounting emphasis on technique. The result? Ironically, it's the fisherman who's been caught, lured away from the simple but important fundamentals that make for successful fishing in the first place. Now more than ever, it's time to get back to the basics of bass fishing.
There's a big one.
Big one, huh?
Big fish. Oh, he's coming under the boat. Oh, man. Got me around the troll motor. Lamb that troll motor. I don't know where he's.
Due to his knowledge and execution of these basics, Hank Parker is acclaimed as the all-time single-season money winner in the history of BASS professional bass fishing. He's also the only sportsman to ever win the BASS Grand Slam.
How about that?
Winner, Bassmasters Classic, BASS Angler of the Year, and winner of Super Bass 4. In 1984, Hank was further catapulted into the public's eye with his own nationally syndicated television series, Hank Parker's Outdoor Magazine. Now Hank Parker brings his expertise and warm personal touch together for the first time in this powerfully motivating and information-packed video presentation, focusing in great detail on the basics of bass fishing.
I have never caught fish as strong as that. Boy, that's a good-looking spot. I'm going to give that a try. Hey, I'm getting ready to go fishing, if you couldn't guess. I've got all my tackle out here getting ready, reading the map. But you know, there's a lot more to prepare to go fishing than just reading a map or getting your tackle ready. You know, there's a lot of technology been introduced in fishing in the last 5 or 6 years, and everybody's getting caught up in all the new innovative products, getting caught up in technique, and we've gotten away from the basics of fishing. That's what I want to talk about, the basics of bass fishing. You know, there's 4 basic fundamentals in bass fishing. Number 1 is consider the fish. Look at it from a fish's perspective. Number 2 is your position. Are you in a proper position to make a cast to catch that fish? Number 3 is your tackle. Consider the tackle. Do you have the right tackle to catch that fish and to make that cast? Number 4 is technique. I want to go back and talk to you now about number 1, consider the fish. Now, there's 3 seasons of the year as far as the fish are concerned. You've got spawning season, pre-spawn, just before they spawn, post-spawn, right after the spawn. Now, there's one thing or 2 things basically that takes precedence in a fish's life as far as a bass. Food and cover, in that order. Food and cover, except for the spawning season. During the spawning season, the spawn takes precedence over everything else. Fish are going to be in shallow water areas looking for a place to spawn. They're not going to be interested in food. But first of all, you got to remember that those fish, 3 or 2 seasons out of the year, are considering food and cover. Now, if you're looking for the fish, that's the first thing that I look for. I look for an area where there's food and there's cover. Now, before I go to a lake, the very first question I ask, has the water been rising or falling? I already know whether it's spawning season or pre or post spawn, but I don't know if the water's been rising or falling. That's very important. If the water's been rising, the fish will be on the inside of the cover. They'll be in the back of the creeks or the back of the coves or the back of the boat dock. If the water's been falling, they'll be on the outside of the cover, or they'll be on the outside of the creeks or at the mouth of the tributaries or on the front of the boat dock. Fish will move with the water, and a lot of fish move pretty fast with the water. When the water starts to change, they'll adapt to that and move real quick. They don't like the fact that the water's falling, and they'll get themselves on the outside of the cover. That's very, very critical. If you go to a lake and you know all the conditions, you take into consideration the water temperature, which is very, very important. When you take into consideration the season, whether it's spawning, post, or pre-spawn, and you're fishing the inside of the cover and the water's been falling, you're probably not going to find the fish. So it's very important to know the conditions. Learn those conditions before you go on the lake. Take all that into consideration and look at it from the fish's perspective. If you're fishing deep water, The same principle applies. Even though they're not intimidated about the water leaving them, going to leave them high and dry, so to speak, but they're also going to move with that current. You know, fish face the current always. Fish feed into the current. Remember that. Fish always face the current. If you're fishing a major reservoir or a river, the current is dictated by the flow of the river, or a major reservoir many times if they're pulling current from the dam, generating power. If you're fishing a small lake like a farm pond or a watershed lake, a lot of times the wind will dictate the current. And you know, it's very hard to cast into the wind, and most people, for convenience sake, will cast with the wind because it's much easier. But consider the fish. He's facing the current. And if the wind's blowing hard and generating a current, that fish is facing, so you need to actually cast into the wind. Makes it a lot more difficult, but you'll catch a lot more fish. So you've got to stop and consider the fish. Now, there's a lot of variables. That's one thing about fishing. In every aspect, there is a lot of variables. But when you think about that fish, there's a lot of variables as well. Now, a fish, again, he starts out as a little fry or a minnow. He's got a lot of predators. But as that fish gets older and gets bigger, he loses a lot of those predators. He gets bigger, he doesn't have to worry about the birds, or he doesn't have to worry about the turtles. He gets big enough, he's pretty secure. And all of his instincts are geared as a little minnow to protecting him from all these different predators. Keep in mind, a bass does not have a mind to reason as a human does. But a bass has a tremendous instinct to protect himself from all these predators. But as that bass gets older, his predator and his major predator is the angler. So consider that. Be quiet. Sneak up on the fish. Try and get yourself in a position where you're not alerting that fish before you ever get there. You know, again, and I'm always hung up on these four, but there's four basic ways to catch a bass. One is you can catch a bass when he's feeding. When that fish moves in position to feed and he's feeding on minnows or shad or crawfish or whatever prey he's feeding on, he's a lot easier to catch. You can trick him, you can fool him, he's aggressive. Number two is you can catch a fish through enticement. You know, you can eat a big meal, for example, kind of a crude illustration, but you can eat a big meal, and if somebody came along and offered you a steak, you probably wouldn't be interested. But if they came by and offered you an after-dinner meal, you'd probably take them up on it. So that's kind of the same technique that applies with a fish. If that fish is fed up and he's been schooling or feeding on shad, and he's fed up and he's not interested, you can take a little small minnow, a surface bait, or a little small worm, and you can finesse and catch that fish through enticement. You can entice him into taking that bait. The third way to catch that bass is you can intimidate him. You can infringe upon his territory and intimidate that fish into taking your bait. You know, a fish does not have hands or feet. He can't defend himself like you or I would defend himself. You can invade his territory by flipping a plastic worm or a jig or something, and you can intimidate that fish into striking your lure. The fourth technique for catching that bass is impulse. That's my favorite technique. I catch more fish out of impulse than I do any other technique that I use. And by impulse, I mean you have that fish to react before he ever realizes there is a bait and before he has time to let his instincts take over and warn him that that's the predator, the angler. What I mean by that is, say for example, an illustration, if you've got a stump or if you've got a brush pile, and you cast beyond that brush pile or beyond that stump and start to bring your lure back, that bass has time to see that lure coming, consider it, let his instincts take over, and warn him that that's the predator. If you were to make that cast, say a flip, or underhanded cast that spinnerbait or that crankbait right by that stump, and the fish is here and your bait lands right there, that fish many times, he reacts to that bait out of impulse before he ever has time to consider it. So those are some of the things that I want you to think about. What I want to stress in this tape, if nothing else, I want to stress to you to think about the fish. You know, again, and I'll mention it, and I'll mention it several times throughout the tape, we're so wrapped up in technique, we don't stop and consider the fish. We go out there and we use a spinnerbait because we're specialists at spinnerbait fishing. Or we go out there and we flip because we spent $59 and bought a new graphite flipping rod and we've gotten into flipping and we really like that technique. Or we love to catch them on topwater. I don't know how many times I've heard people say that. Man, I'd rather catch one on topwater and I had 10 on a worm or 10 on a crankbait or any other kind of bait. It doesn't matter what I catch a bass on, I enjoy it just as much. That's one thing that I've been fortunate in as a tournament fisherman. I honestly don't have a favorite bait. And that's something else that I want to mention while I'm on that, favorite bait. Most everybody has got a favorite bait. And you'll take that favorite bait and you'll go to the lake, and that's what you're going to start with almost every time, regardless of the season. You know, we talked about consider the season, whether it's spawning or pre-spawn or post-spawn. You'll still go back to that same bait, regardless of the season. Get away from that. I'll tell you one way, just a little tip to improve your fishing. Put your favorite bait in your tackle box or hide it in your sock drawer or put it in the garage for a year. Don't take it fishing. Leave it at home. And you'll learn to use a lot of other baits and you'll be more versatile. But the one thing that you do with your favorite bait, you put it up, you don't take it out, you go to the lake, you get on the water, and the first thing that I ask myself when I go into an area or a bay or a creek and I start, you know, I've taken all the variables into consideration, I'm looking for a place to start fishing now, and I see a place either on the map or visually, a grass bed or a treetop or something that I think it looks good. The first thing that I ask myself, and I recommend you do the same, is what lure do I have that would most thoroughly fish the structure? And you go from there. That pretty well covers the fish's perspective. Now let's talk about consider your position. Now that is a wide topic. A lot of people get in a position where they can't make the proper cast. Now we've taken all the variables into consideration as to where to start fishing, what the season is, what kind of lure we need to choose to fish the cover, and if you're out of position, a lot of times it'll do you absolutely no good. I'll give you an illustration. Let's talk about fishing a leaning log, for example. If you're going to fish a lay down or a blow down or a leaning log that's fallen, say the wind's blowing it down into the water, which is a primary piece of structure for bass, especially in the southeast where I grew up. I grew up fishing a lake that was the #1 pattern for catching fish in the springtime. But you take that leaning log, that bass can be positioned on that log any one place. I mean, you can't look at that log and say, well, he's going to be right here in 2 foot of water or he's going to be here in 3 foot of water. That fish could be anywhere along that log. So let's say you looked at that structure, as I just mentioned earlier, and you chose a spinnerbait to fish that cover. And you felt like you could do a better job fishing that log with a spinnerbait than any other lure. If your boat is out of position where you have to throw across that log 5 or 6 or 7 times to cover it, you may never catch that fish. You know, I talked earlier about the fact that a fish has a predator, and that predator is the angler. If he has time to look at your bait 5 or 6 casts before you ever make the presentation right to him, he may never hit your bait. He's alerted. His instincts have warned him that the predator's around. So what you want to do is you want to get yourself in the position. Get your boat in position if you're fishing from a boat. If you're walking the bank or fishing a shoreline or wade or walk around, and get yourself in a position before you make the first cast at that piece of structure. Get that boat or get your body in position to make a cast with that spinnerbait that I was talking right down that leaning log and parallel. Bring that bait right down that log. You'll catch a fish many, many times that you would never catch if you brought it across the log horizontally. That is very, very important. I cannot tell you the times that I've been in tournament situations fishing behind other anglers, and the guys would be out of position, casting into the brush pile sideways or vertically, and you come behind them and make a proper cast and have your boat positioned where you can make that cast and catch the fish. And unfortunately, I hate to admit it, but I've had it happen to me as well. I talked about the wind and the current, and the fish face the current. I remember distinctly one of the very first tournaments that I ever fished, Roland Martin came in behind me on a little island and caught a big string of fish after I left it. And the only thing he did different from myself is he fished into the wind. He positioned his boat where he could make a cast and make that presentation to those fish that were facing that wind. And that's where I messed up. So position a boat where you can make the cast. That's very, very important. I can't talk about it enough. I mean, you need to get where you can make the cast, bring the bait down, whatever, whether it be the leaning log that I talked about or the grass bed. You know, a lot of our lakes now, we've got a lot of aquatic growth of weeds, hydrilla, different kinds of moss. And throughout all of my career as fishing, going to these different lakes, I have rarely ever caught bass way up in the grass. if it's not a cold front condition, the vast majority of the time, those fish are on the outside or within 3 to 5 feet of the weed line where it stops. Tommy Martin, one of the best fishermen I know in the state of Texas, we call him the Hydrilla King. You go to Toledo Bend or Sam Rayburn, some of the big lakes out in Texas, he just dominates those because he's so good at fishing that grass. I flat asked him one day, I said, Tommy, what in the world makes you so good at fishing the grass? He said, Hank, the most important thing fishing a grass line is a good pair of Polaroid sunglasses. First person ever told me that. I thought the most important thing was the depth finder. He said, no, I choose Polaroid sunglasses over the depth finder. I can see where that weed line breaks. And if you're up in that weed line, you're not going to catch those fish. You need to be right on that break where you can fish that bait right on the break, 2 or 3 foot on the outside of the line. And when I say break line, I'm just talking about where that grass stops growing. You know, a lot of the grass, it will grow 10 feet deep and it stops. So right here in 11 or 12 foot of water, you got clean bottom. But the point that I'm making is keep that boat positioned where you can make that cast in that 2 or 3 or 4 foot of grass all the way out to the clean bottom. If you're up in the grass, you're not going to catch them. And that is critical. I cannot tell you how many times in the state of Florida, in Texas, in New York, where I've fished and the guys have been up in the grass not catching fish, or I've been up in the grass not catching fish, and the guys that held that boat on the weed line were catching fish simply because they had their boat positioned right. One thing that I want to stress is try and establish a pattern. Many times we go out and we fish, you know, we fish national tournaments, or I do, and there are 3 days of practice and then 3 days of competition. In that 3 days of practice, we try to establish, as a tournament fisherman, a pattern. Now, I don't care if you're a tournament fisherman, a weekend novelist, or if you fish twice a year. I'll promise you, I'll absolutely promise you, you'll catch more fish day in and day out if you try to establish a pattern. And when I say a pattern, I'll give you a real crude little illustration. Let's say, for example, you've taken the variables that we talked about earlier, the water temperature, the spawning season, whether the water been rising or falling. You've taken all of those variables into consideration, and you've chosen an area now to start fishing. You've chosen a lure. You've looked at the structure, and you've chosen a lure. For illustration's sake, I'm going to say a small crankbait that will run about 5 feet deep. You chose that crankbait, now you're starting to fish in the back of a little bay. You're fishing along that bay. You fish 100 yards of shoreline. It's kind of a little pebble bank or sandy bank. You fish 100 yards of shoreline with this little crankbait, and you don't catch any fish at all. All of a sudden, you come to just a small indentation in the bank with a little stump on a point. You catch a bass. You cast that same crankbait that you'd fished down that 100-yard stretch and didn't catch a fish by that stump. You catch a fish. You continue on down that shoreline. Again, you don't catch anything. You go 50, 100 yards. You come to another stump. You catch another fish. You hadn't caught anything on the plain shoreline. Both of the fish that you caught were on the stumps. Now, if it were me, I'm no longer going to continue to fish down that shoreline. I'm going to start looking for stumps. I have a pattern. And that, a lot of times you'll start out and you'll fish. You know, a lot of the guys on the tournament circuit, they'll get frustrated after the first day of practice because they didn't catch any fish. You've eliminated a lot of water, and that's very important. Now, you can afford, if you've got 3 or 4 days, certainly you can afford to be more thorough than if you've only got a half a day or 1 day to fish. But if you're fishing a tournament, I recommend especially be very thorough. Fish that whole shoreline or that whole bay or that whole cove. But if you've only got a half a day or a day to fish, fish a lot faster, eliminate the water a lot quicker. But just because you don't catch anything, that will help you to eliminate water and know what to do next. Now, if I would have fished that shoreline and not caught anything at all on that little crankbait, then I would have gotten away from that shoreline. I would not have fished another one. If I went in the next cove, I wouldn't have fished that type of shoreline. And a lot of people get hung up on changing baits. You know, if I choose a lure that I feel like thoroughly fishes that structure, I'm not going to start changing baits and changing colors and doing this and that and the other. I'm going to start looking for new water. Now, if I get a few strikes or fish follow the bait up or have some short hits, then I'll start changing baits or colors. But if I see no movement, no activity, no bait, no fish chasing any bait, nothing, then I leave that area and I try to establish a different type of pattern. So it's a process of elimination, and that's a lot of what fishing is, and that goes back, and that's exactly what I want to talk to. The fundamentals, you know, it's not all that complex. We've got a lot of complex equipment and a lot of techniques that are pretty complex, But fishing in general is very basic and very simple. Let's talk about the third basic area now. Consider your tackle. Now you can see I've got all kind of tackle here. I got specialty rods and reels. I've got basic rods and reels. I've got 3 different types of monofilament fishing line. I've got the latest in electronic technology. I've got all types of baits, spinner baits, crankbaits, buzz baits, worms, jigs. All of this can be very, very complex. But at the same time, it can be very basic. Now, as far as a rule of thumb, let's take a rod and reel, for example. That's a good starting point. As a rule of thumb, if I'm using 10-pound test line or lighter, I use a spinning rod. If I use 10-pound test or heavier, I use a casting rod. Now, 10-pound is kind of marginal for me. I may use casting or spinning. Let's say, why do you do that? Well, if you take a spinning rod, for example, and a spinning reel, if you're trying to throw lighter baits, it's much easier. If you're throwing into the wind, it's a lot easier. You don't have to worry about overrun or professional overrun or backlash. You can cast that and handle it a lot better. But it's also a better rod and reel combination for handling a big fish on light line. The displacement of the guides on the spinning rod are down. Let me show you what I'm talking about. You look at a casting rod that I have here. Now, a casting rod works like a winch. And as you can see, these guides are a top side. They're on the top of the blank. Now, if this rod was made soft enough to absorb the energy necessary for 8-pound test line, you can see here as I bend this rod that this line wants to touch the rod blank itself. Now, that creates a lot of friction. And that's where you get your line problem. That's where you break the line. Heat or friction is probably the most destructive thing to monofilament fishing line. So when you get a lot of that bend or parabolic action in a spinning rod to absorb that energy of the light line, you also, or on a casting rod, you touch the blank. On a spinning rod, your guides are like this. They're down. They're not touching the blank. And when the rod bends, your line don't get on the blank at all. So you can fish lighter line on a spinning rod without any friction, without that line making contact with the blank. So I say when you're using light line, it's better to use a spinning rod. If you're using heavier line, of course the casting reel that I have here works much like a winch. You can just kind of tuck it in and winch that fish in, so you can take advantage of using that heavy line. If you put it on a spinning rod that don't have a lot of power or a lot of guts to the reel, then it defeats the purpose to use 17 or 20-pound test line because you don't have enough power to take advantage of it. You do with a casting rod. Now that's pretty simple, pretty basic. If I'm using a lure like, say, a crankbait with small hooks, a bait like I have here, treble hooks, I don't necessarily, unless I'm fishing in real heavy cover, need to use 17 or 20-pound test line. I'm not going to put that much pressure on the fish. Therefore, I would choose a rod that had, say, a medium type power, not action. Now, there's a big difference in power and action, and a lot of people get that confused. Let me give you an illustration. You can talk about a worm action rod. Really, it's not a worm action, it's a worm power. Power is the strength of the rod. And for an illustration, you can take 2 rods and they can bend in the exact same place. One would bend a lot more than the other with the same amount of pressure. They've both got the same action, but the one that bends the least, that resists that pressure the most, is the stiffer rod, which would be the heavier power. So choose by power rather than by action. Action has very little to do with the stiffness of a rod. So take a rod that has say a medium power to fish that 12, 14-pound line when you fish your treble hooks and your lighter baits, and you're not going to hoss that fish. Now, if you're using a plastic worm, for example, it takes a lot of energy on a long cast. You know, your line's going to stretch a little bit. The water's going to absorb some of that shock. So you don't want your rod to absorb the shock. You want to choose a rod that's stiff and it's not going to absorb any of that shock, where you can get that hook set in that worm or that jig or whatever heavy bait like a spinner bait that you're using. So that's pretty basic. I use a stiff rod when I'm fishing a worm or a spinner bait or a single hook bait, a heavy bait like a jig. And I use a medium action or a medium power or light power when I'm fishing the treble hooks or the lighter baits. You don't need 400 rods and reels to start with. Now, I probably own 60, as you can see all these rods that I got out here. But they've all serve a special purpose for me, but you don't have to have that to start with. And it can confuse you to get too much equipment until you learn the basics. So basically, in rods and reels, when you fish light line, you need to have a spinning rod, something medium to light action if you're fishing, or light power, there I go talking action. Or if you're fishing casting rods, heavier line, you need the casting rod and reel, something you can use as a winch. So that's pretty basic. Now we can talk about specialty rods, flipping techniques, deep cranking, all of that. I'll do that in a later video. I want to talk about today about the basics. So basically, you need that spinning rod, medium action, light action. You need your casting rods for your heavier line, your heavier type baits like a plastic worm. All right, let's talk about fishing line. We talk about a rod and a reel that will absorb energy. Now there's a lot of different kind of lines out on the market today. If I'm fishing a spinnerbait, or if I'm fishing in heavy cover, I want a line that is abrasion resistant. I want something that I can fish through that cover that's not going to cut my line. You know, when you're fishing around a rock or a stump or something, that fish runs you around that rock or runs you behind that stump or across the boat dock. If your line is a very soft line, he'll cut the line. This right here is a line that I use. It's a small diameter line. It's very thin, but I would never use or recommend a limp line. This line extra limp. I would never use that around rocks or heavy cover. I would prefer to use a line that had a thicker skin that could resist that abrasion. Now that's pretty simple. If you're fishing open water, you want a light limp line. If you're fishing heavy cover, you want a stiff line that will resist abrasion. All right, let's talk about different types of lures. Again, you can get lost going in a tackle shop, and I don't know how many times I've done it myself, gone in a store and come out with $400 worth of stuff, put it in a tackle box and never ever get it wet. Or if I do, I'm just experimenting. There's basic lures that you need. I'm not saying that every lure on a store rack won't catch a fish and have an application, but you can get so confused trying to have a wide array of lures until you're grounded on the basics. What you need to do is select baits that have a specific purpose, like a deep crankbait, a shallow crankbait, a spinnerbait and a buzzbait, a plastic worm, a jig and pig. You're pretty well covering the basics when you add the top water bait. You need a surface lure, and then you've got it covered. Now anything else from there is just a deviation for specialized techniques. Those are the basics. Now as you can see, I've got 400 kinds of spinner baits. I've got probably 350 or 400 different types of crankbaits. I've got a lot of different lures, but those are all for specialized techniques. They are not at all necessary for the basics, and that's what I want you to get grounded on, is get the basic lures. Get your deep diving crankbait, get your shallow running crankbait, get your spinnerbait, get your buzzbait, get your topwater lure, and last but definitely not least, plastic worm. Now these are your basic baits. These are all the baits you need to start with. Now it's time to go to our fourth area, techniques. Consider your techniques. Now that is again another broad topic. There's a lot of different techniques and a lot of different applications for different types of fishing and styles and what we term as techniques. Now, I have a lot of specialty rods, as I mentioned, for different kind of techniques, but they're basic techniques that day in and day out consistently produce fish. And this is what you need to get grounded in as the fundamentals of fishing. You've taken in all the considerations to how to find the fish, the times of year, the seasons, the position of your boat, your different kind of rods and reels and lures. You've got everything down pat now, where to go, but it's very important to consider your technique. Now I recommend that you have the basic rods and reels, the basic lures, and apply the basic techniques. It's much easier for the beginning fisherman to fish visual cover. Start to fish shorelines, cover that you can see, tree laps that are above the water that you can see that stick out above the water, grass beds, lily pads, boat docks. Any kind of visual cover is the best place if you're just beginning to fish. And you can relate to it as you cast. You know what your lure's doing. You know in what proximity of the cover that you saw where your bait is at. And it's much easier to adapt to visual cover in the beginning. And then gradually work your way to submerged brush piles, any kind of stump rows or underwater structure. Underwater structure that you cannot visually see, that you find on your LCR or your locator, is a lot more difficult to fish in the beginning than is structure that you see above the water. So you need to start, and the technique that I recommend in the beginning is to fish visual structure. Now there's a lot of different variations to what kind of techniques you can use to fish, and I couldn't begin to start to name them all. But let me talk basically again. Just talk about the kind of equipment and the kind of techniques that apply in most circumstances and situations. Now, there's a lot of variations depending on where you live, what part of the country you fish, and the types of reservoirs, lakes, watersheds, ponds, or whatever. If you're fishing a smaller pond, then obviously your structure is more limited than someone that would say fishing a Toledo Bend where you've got 70,000 acres of flooded timber, grass, lily pads, and all the different kind of structure. So you need to stick with a technique that works for you. If you're fishing a farm pond that's grown over with grass, then you're probably going to fish some type of weedless surface bait. If you're fishing a lake like out in Arizona, Lake Powell, that is a bowl lake that has very little cover other than rock slides, then you're going to fish light line and deep water. You're going to fish heavier type baits. You're going to fish much deeper than you would if you were fishing in Florida. So it's a lot of variation depending on what part of the country you're fishing and what type of lake. I recommend a standard 5.5 foot rod if you're going to cast a heavy cover. I recommend that you use just a basic casting motion. I like an underhand casting technique. Now, a lot of people still use the old style overhand, but if you'll get in practice and you'll start to practice and get in the swing of things, you can use the underhand technique. It's very simple. It's kind of like opening a door, kind of turning the doorknob, simply flipping your wrist. It allows you to cast a bait with a casting reel here that I use for flipping the wrist. I can't do it very good with a spinning rod. I'm not a specialist with a spinning rod. But with a casting reel, it's just kind of like opening a doorknob. You just turn that and you can get an underhand cast. It will allow you to make a presentation, keeps your bait and your projective lower to the water. The bait enters the water a lot softer and a lot easier with a lot less effort, and you can see the lure. You can see when to slow it down or when to speed it up when you cast it to make contact with the structure. So I recommend a little underhand flip when you're fishing that visual structure. When you're fishing open water, then the overhand technique is fine. I like longer cast when I'm fishing crankbaits, so I'll use two-handed rod. You know, that's a technique that's very simple. When you're trying to make a long cast, then I would use a rod that would allow me to use two hands for open water. Something like a cranking stick or a flipping rod, something like I have right here. This rod has got a little trigger on it. It will allow you to use two hands. You can heave it, you can cast it much further. And while I'm talking about fishing that open water with crankbait, you know, a lot of times you're fishing deep water crankbaits. I mentioned that's one of your basic lures. Deep water crankbait is probably one of the most effective ways that I use to catch fish off a deep water structure. It's quicker, you can cover a lot more water, you don't have to be as precise. A lot of times when you're fishing plastic worms or jigging spoons, you've got to be right on target. If you're fishing a deep crankbait, you can get away with being off the structure a little bit, not necessarily perfectly in line with where you need to be. So a deep water crankbait forgives you a little bit for being off that structure. And I like that, especially when I'm fishing a lake that I haven't fished very much before. And in order to do that and be effective with that deep water crankbait, you need to use a two-handed rod. You need to be able to heave that bait 50, 60, even 70 yards. And you can do that by using light line, a two-handed rod, and keep in mind also that when you're throwing that big crankbait, something that has a big long lip, heavy half-ounce, three-quarter, 1 ounce crankbait, you need to make a cast and select a rod for making that cast that is pretty stiff. If you use a lighter rod, it absorbs a lot of your energy. It'll take away. You know, it's kind of like an illustration is throwing a pebble. If you're going to throw a marble or a small pebble, it's a lot easier to get distance by flipping your wrist. You put a lot in your wrist. That's the same thing with throwing a light crankbait. If I'm throwing a little bitty light crankbait around the shoreline or boat dock, I prefer to throw it on a spinning rod, something light that I can whip with my wrist and finesse. But if I'm throwing that big crankbait, it's like throwing a hand grenade versus that pebble. You don't ever see anybody throw a hand grenade throwing it like a rock. You can't throw it. Your arm absorbs too much of that energy. If you're going to throw a big boulder, or a brick, or a hand grenade or something, you need to heave it. And it's the same thing with throwing that big crankbait. When you're throwing that big giant crankbait or heavy crankbait, you want a rod you can two-hand, don't absorb the energy, you can get that bait out there 50, 60 yards. And as soon as that bait hits the water, hold that rod tip down, crank it down there, get it to maximum depth. As soon as you hit bottom, slow down with it. By the way, I prefer a high-speed reel with the crankbait. Now let's talk about a plastic worm. You know, I'm covering these basic baits. Now a plastic worm, this particular worm that I have here, I've got it on a light line, 10-pound test line. That's one thing about a plastic worm. You can fish it on from 6-pound line or even 4-pound if you're daring enough. I don't ever fish with 4-pound test line for bass. But 6-pound test line up to 40-pound test line if you need to go that heavy. I rarely ever personally use over 25-pound test line, and that's on rare occasions. Most of the time I worm with 14-pound test line. I think that's a good all-around pound test for the kind of structure that I fish. But anyway, with the plastic worm, you can fish it very slow on the bottom. You can use it with a light lead, a heavy lead. This particular bait, I've got a light lead, or what I term as a light lead, an 1/8 ounce. You can use the bait in heavy cover. You can use it in sparse cover. You use it in shallow water. You can use it in deep water. The most versatile bait that I know of is a plastic worm. I fish a plastic worm awfully slow at times and fairly fast at others. The main thing, you know, a lot of people say, when do you set the hook on a plastic worm? You know, it used to be a technique that you try and break the rod, you know, drop slack and hit him as hard as you can and try and turn the boat over. All of that's not necessary. I try and sharpen my worm hooks always, and I hit that fish sometimes as soon as he taps it. Sometimes I'll wait 2 or 3 seconds. I don't think that there is a model strike for a worm. I think every strike may vary. There's times you need to set that hook immediately. There's times you may need to wait a second or two. So I think there's some variation there. There's not a certain pattern or certain time to set the hook. Some people say count to 3. I don't agree with that. I say set the hook when you know that fish has got it. If he hits it, you can tell with a little bit of experience with the graphite rods that we've got on the market today, as sensitive as they are, you fish that plastic worm a little bit and you'll be able to detect when to set the hook. The one thing that I advise you in a technique for fishing a plastic worm is don't wait too long. The vast majority of the mistakes that are made with a plastic worm, either missing the fish or have the fish wrap you up and come off, or people tend to wait too long on the plastic worm. That fish inhales that bait. Most of the time he's got it. So if you set that hook fast, you're in pretty good shape. You're not going to take it away from him in most cases. And where you really mess up is letting him have it. That fish is liable to swim back in the brush pile or the grass bed and have you wrapped up before you ever set the hook. So the plastic worm and the jig, I fish basically the same way. The only variation I fish in a jigging eel or a jigging pig, opposed to plastic worm, I drag the plastic worm on the bottom a lot. A jigging eel, I like to pick it up. Hook set is basically the same for me with a jig as it is with a plastic worm. Now, let's talk about a spinnerbait. A spinnerbait is a bait that is probably one of the most versatile baits that you can use. It's a lot like a plastic worm. You can fish it up top, you can fish it in heavy cover, you can fish it through the grass, you can fish it in the wintertime, you can fish it in the summertime. There's just a lot of different variations with a spinnerbait. There's tandem spin, single spin. I prefer a tandem spin spinnerbait. I probably fish more tandem spins than I do single spins or any other type of spinnerbait. This particular bait here has a willow leaf blade. Now everybody's talking about the willow leaf blade. Willow leaf is a good blade. It's very effective when you're fishing aquatic growth or vegetation. I still prefer if I'm fishing brush or a lake where there's a lot of wood, logs, and that type of cover, stumps, I prefer the straight Colorado blades, which is like this little blade that I have here. I think you'll catch a lot more fish in the wintertime with a vibrating bait than I do with a willow leaf bait, which doesn't put out very much vibration when you're fishing wood. Again, when you're fishing aquatic growth, simply because that bait will come through that cover more, you can fish the willow leaf blade, and it's very effective as well. And if you've got fish that tend to be spooky or heavily fished, you may want a little less vibration, and the willow leaf will definitely put off less vibration than will the Colorado, which is the round blade like this small blade that I have here. But you know, one reason I like a tandem spin, and a lot of people ask me this, well, why do you use a tandem over a single? I think that a tandem spin bait, for me at least, is more weedless. It seems like if you've got two blades turning, and you run that bait through a brush pile or a leaning log, and one blade hits a limb and stops turning, you still got one blade turning to keep that bait on an even keel. So a spinnerbait is a good bait. It's a versatile bait. I would say if I were going to choose one spinnerbait, and we're talking Hank Parker, if I was going to choose one spinnerbait, it would be a tandem spin spinnerbait, much like the bait I have here with either a Willa or a Colorado. And by the way, you can change these blades. You don't have to have 50 different spinnerbaits. You can take this blade right here and just slip it off, put a Colorado on. So it's also a very versatile bait in ways that you can make it up. You can change skirts, different colors. You can put little trailers on the back. So you can do a lot with a spinnerbait. That is one of my favorite baits, one of 40. All right, let's talk about surface lures. Now, I don't have a surface lure tied on right here, or yes, I do. I happen to have one under all these other rods. A surface lure is a bait that can be fished in a lot of different ways. Now, there's a lot of different kind of surface lures. There's surface lures that have propellers on the front. This particular bait here is a bait that is a walking bait. This bait has no action at all unless you use the rod, and you can make it walk from side to side. It is probably my favorite topwater bait, this particular walking bait. A topwater bait is pretty easy to fish. You know, you can throw it out there and you work it on the top, and if the fish are active and aggressive, you can fish it fast. If they're not aggressive and you're trying to coax them into hitting your bait or finesse like I talked about earlier, you may want to fish it slower. But the one trick that I think that everybody needs to bear in mind with a topwater bait, and where people make mistakes, just like with a plastic worm where they wait too late most of the time, it's vice versa with a topwater bait. They jerk too soon. It's very hard to discipline yourself when you see a big fish blow up on a topwater bait not to set the hook. But I'll promise you, if you jerk when you see that fish hit that bait, you'll miss that fish more times than you'll catch him. The rule that I use in fishing a topwater bait is do not jerk until you feel the fish. Don't jerk until you feel it. Keep winding. If you're working your reel and your rod and working that bait, keep right on winding at the same pace till you feel him, and then set the hook. That's very important. You'll miss a fish a lot of times with a topwater bait by reacting on the strike. Wait till you feel the fish. Now that pretty well covers your basic baits. Now I know that doesn't tell you every single technique for all these different lures. There's different ways you can fish them, but that's the basics. And once you get those basics down and learn to fish them, then you can get in all the specialized techniques and variations that you need to go to, and all the different colors and all the size and shapes. There's a lot of other applications, but these basic principles and techniques will help you catch more fish and understand what you're doing and what you're fishing for and how to fish. A lot of people are so caught up in the different techniques that they don't understand the basic principles, and as they get so far off in left field with all the techniques and all the colors and all the lures, they become so confused that they really don't know where to go next, what to do next. If this doesn't work, they're lost. Understand the basics, and that'll help you catch more fish. Well, that pretty well covers the basics. Now we've got some other tapes coming out. We've got them almost finished now on some of the specialized techniques like spinner baits, flipping, deep water cranking, that I know you'll be interested in the future, so be sure and look for those. I tell you, all this fish talk's got me fired up. I'm going fishing. And I'm not going to wish you any luck, because I know if you'll follow these basic ideas, you're going to catch some fish. See you around.
If you'd like more information about Hank Parker's complete video library for the outdoorsman, just drop him a line. Write Hank Parker, P.O. Box 305, Denver, North Carolina, 28037.
There he is. Good fish. Oh, big fish, big fish. Oh, man. Look what a fish. Oh, God. Boy. Man, got a big one. Oh, come here, baby. Man, look at the mouth on that fish. Whew. Can you believe that? Look what a mouth. Man, that is a giant.